Seated. Really good to see everyone. Was wondering who might show up. It's a pretty goodly group, I'd say, this morning. What would you say?
Yep.
Yeah, good. Everybody have a pretty good Christmas day, those that we didn't see? Okay? All right. I just don't know where to go with this sermon. There's so many directions I want to go. Life is such a gift, isn't it? I mean, such a wonderful, marvelous gift. And each of us have a story in that gift that we sometimes take for granted. We come every Christmas and we hear this beautiful, compelling, sacred story of the birth of Christ. And we tell it over again every year, right? We love to hear the story. Tell me the story one more time of Jesus' birth. It's a wonderful, amazing story. But I think sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that are our stories. In the beginning was the Word, but in the beginning for us sometimes is our own story, and coming to terms with the fact that our story counts too. We have a holy story, every one of us. And our sacred story, if it's grounded in Christ, is a beautiful, beautiful story. I have things that come to my mind when we sing these hymns. Once in Royal David's City. How many of you have listened to that and watched a Christmas pageant in process? It's a choice one for the procession of Mary. And I was thinking as we were singing that back to the time when I was 3 years old. How many of you remember when you were 3? Yeah, there you go. A lot of people don't have that gift. If you can remember when you're 3, it's a gift. I was an angel at that time. It was the last time that ever happened.
When did you change?
Yeah, I changed right. I'm going to tell you when I changed. Right at this moment. My mother was playing the organ. We were in an orphanage and children's home in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Blue Ridge School outside of Charlottesville, Virginia, where my parents were house parents to a cottage of about 20 boys. And I was the only son at the time, natural son, and then my sister was born while we were there. But there was the Christmas pageant in the beautiful old stone chapel that was built during the Depression era by local people. They brought the stones and they built this amazing chapel with great stained glass windows and a nice little pipe organ that my mother was playing for the Christmas pageant, and she played regularly actually for Sunday services. But I remembered Once in Royal David's City. I think that was the hymn we were singing. And I was about the 5th or 6th angel in line, 3-year-old boy, and in front of me was a 3-year-old girl who I had a crush on. And she was the most beautiful angel I could ever imagine. And I kissed her. And like I'm saying, that's when I stopped being an angel. But I remember it just like that. I remember kissing that girl, that angel I should say. And I didn't get in trouble for it. That was the best part. But I remember it to this day, the first time I kissed. 3 years old. That's pretty good, isn't it?
Yeah.
Pretty good. But that's part of my sacred story. Being an angel in that pageant and hearing my mom play the organ. You have your sacred stories too, don't you? Those beginning times in your faith when you began to believe there must be a God. And then you began to get more particular about it, that God has come to us in the person of Jesus. And you've seen the pageants and we celebrate it every year, but it became really personal to you, and you began to realize, oh my gosh, God came not just for the whole world, but God came for me personally. And so suddenly your sacred story began to get wrapped up in the bigger story of God's love for the world. Isn't that powerful? Isn't that powerful? I'm going to tell you another story today. And I'm sure I've shared this before, but maybe I'll share it a little differently. I was inspired by the reading about Galatians. Paul says, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as children. Anybody in here adopted? Okay, good. You're all adopted, actually. You didn't know that? And because you are children, God has sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. That word Abba in Aramaic was more like Daddy. It's that heart cry, Daddy. Some more people driving up. Maybe we're going to expand here. That's good. So you are no longer a slave, but a child, and if a child, then also an heir through God. Well, I relate to this at a personal level because my mother is adopted. And if she hadn't been adopted, I wouldn't be standing here today speaking to you. So the story I'm going to tell you is why I'm here today. It's part of my sacred story. My mother was born in 1930. What happened around 1932? Anybody know?
Depression.
The Great Depression, right. So she was born in Jacksonville to an abusive home, and she was removed along with her sister, who she didn't know at the time. Obviously, they were little kids, like two. They didn't know they were removed together. And she was placed in an orphanage in Jacksonville, Florida. She had lived in a place called Booger Bottom. Sounds pretty horrible, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. It was horrible. And I won't go into that story, but I found out a lot about Booger Bottom and how she was abused as a little infant and toddler. But she was abused so badly that she could hardly hear. Her ears were so beaten. And my grandmother and grandfather, Dar and Hanson McNamara, lived in Atlanta, Georgia. They were childless. They had tried. They had one miscarriage, and then they actually had a child in their home for a while, and they were about to adopt this foster child, and then for whatever reason the agency said you can't adopt. So that broke their hearts. Well, I found out about my grandmother from my sister, who spent a lot of time with my grandmother, that she was a very independent woman. She would take the train out west by herself. My grandfather was busy working or whatever. I don't know what he was doing, but he was not the adventurer that Dar was. Dar, named short for Dorothy, would take the train to the Great Tetons, or to Glacier, or to other places. And I know this because she brought back souvenir spoons, which are now in my daughter's possession. One of her train rides from Atlanta was just down to Jacksonville, Florida. And for whatever reason, she was at the orphanage, which still exists today. It's the Children's Home Society in Jacksonville. Back then it was called the Jacksonville Orphanage. And she's at the playground looking through the fence at the orphans, true orphans back in that time. And there was one orphan sitting off to herself on the steps, not playing with the others. It turns out that was my mother. And Nancy, young Nancy, was by herself because she had an ear infection. And she hurt. She couldn't play. But the story started from there. And so my grandmother said, that is the child I want to adopt. And how that played out, I don't really know. I even called my godfather this morning to find out if he remembers how she ever got back to Atlanta. But all I know is that from that point forward, my grandmother determined she was going to adopt that little girl. And the first time, this is the lore anyway, I don't know if it's fact, but I know from the family lore that the first time my mother, Nancy, saw her mother-to-be, Dar, at the orphanage, she cried out, "Mama!" Well, that did it. If she did that, that sealed the deal, right? So somehow, miraculously, with a story I do not know, my mother in Jacksonville and my grandmother who had taken a train to Jacksonville, somehow, over time, gets her adopted and back to Atlanta. I imagine the Placement Society probably gave her a trial placement in Atlanta, and that's how it all took place. But we don't know the details. All I know is that image of this little girl who could hardly hear, crying out, "Mama." And that's when I think of, when I hear Abba, Father, I think of that joy of a child who's about to be adopted, crying out and saying, "You are the one I've been looking for." Well, the story of my mother is wonderful because she became a classical musician. This little girl who could hardly hear played in the Atlanta Symphony, played French horn. She played in the Charlottesville Symphony. She also was a classical pianist, and actually piano was her major instrument. So as a child, I spent hours just listening to my mom play piano. And now I look back on it and I think that this was a woman who as a child could barely hear. And now she's a classical musician because she was adopted by a family who loved her and nurtured her talents. And that's who we are, friends. We are like, as Paul says, you're no longer slaves. You're no longer a nothing. You are something. And you are someone. Why? Because you've been adopted. You've been picked. You've been chosen. You've been called into a family embrace. You are somebody. Isn't that a joyful story? I thank God for that story because I think that's partly why I'm a priest today, that story of my mom. It's a story of incredible grace and being chosen for a purpose. So I want you to think about your sacred stories at Christmas time. Yeah, it's important we think about Jesus' story because it is the most wonderful story of all. But it doesn't change us until we think about our story and how we relate to the gift that God has given us in Christ. So you might get tired of hearing the hymns, singing the hymns, every single last verse except for today. Right? But they're telling the story. Every stanza, every verse of those hymns tells a story that we need to hear. And we need to remember, it's not just that story back then. It's our story now, our sacred story. The story of Stuart as an angel fallen at age 3, kissing the other angel. That story is made holy because he's now in Christ. Your story, no matter what it is somehow adopted into the loving arms of a God who sought you out and said, that's the one. That's the one that's going to be my son. That's going to be my daughter. And you, in your joy, cry out, Abba, Daddy, I want to be your child. That's the kind of joy we should bring to Christmas, knowing that we've been chosen, that we're entering into the loving embrace of a holy family that is forever our family. Once in royal David's city. We were there. You were there. You didn't know it, but you were once there in royal David's city. And that story is part of yours right now, wherever you are. Thanks be to God.